The year was 732 AD, and Europe was on the verge of becoming Islamic. For a century, the armies of Islam had exploded out of Arabia in one of history's most spectacular military expansions. They had conquered the Persian Empire. They had torn half the Byzantine Empire away. They had swept across North Africa, erasing centuries of Christian civilization. They had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered nearly all of Hispania, what we now call Spain and Portugal. City after city fell. Christian kingdoms crumbled. The Visigothic kingdom of Spain, which had ruled Iberia for 3 centuries, was destroyed in less than a decade. And now, in October 732, an army of perhaps 80,000 Muslim warriors was riding north through France, heading toward the heart of Christian Europe. They had already sacked Bordeaux. They were now advancing on Tours, home to the shrine of Saint Martin, one of the richest religious sites in Western Christendom. Nothing seemed capable of stopping them. The Frankish nobles were divided, their kingdoms weak and fractured. The great cities of the Roman Empire were ruins or distant memories. The Islamic cavalry, battle-hardened from a century of conquest, moved with the confidence of men who believed God had ordained their victory. And standing in their way, assembling his forces near the town of Tours, was Charles, the bastard son of a Frankish noble, a man who would earn a nickname that would echo through history: Martel, the Hammer. To understand what happened at Tours, you must understand what had come before. In 711, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa into Spain with approximately 7,000 men. He landed at a rock that would forever bear his name: Jabal Tariq, the Rock of Tariq, Gibraltar. King Roderick of the Visigoths marched to meet him with an army that should have crushed the invaders. Instead, at the Battle of Guadalete, Roderick's army was destroyed. The king himself was killed. Within 7 years, nearly all of Iberia was under Muslim control. The speed of the conquest was staggering. Cities that had been Christian for centuries welcomed Muslim rule or surrendered without fighting. The Islamic forces offered better terms than the Visigothic kings had provided. Jews who had been persecuted under Christian rule often assisted the Muslim conquest. The social structure of Visigothic Spain simply collapsed. By 720, the Muslims controlled everything south of the Pyrenees and were beginning to probe north into Francia. Small raids at first, testing the defenses, seeing how the Franks would respond. The response was chaotic. The Frankish kingdom was not a unified nation. It was a collection of competing nobles, regional strongmen, and weak kings. When the Muslims made their first serious incursion into France in 721, they besieged Toulouse. Duke Odo of Aquitaine managed to defeat them, but it was clear that the raids would continue and grow larger. Charles Martel was not supposed to be in a position to save Europe. He was the illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, the mayor of the palace, and the real power behind the Merovingian kings who technically ruled Francia. When Pepin died in 714, Charles was imprisoned by his stepmother, who wanted her own sons to inherit power. Charles escaped, raised an army, and spent years fighting civil wars to establish his authority. By 732, he was the undisputed military leader of the Franks, though technically still just the mayor of the palace, not the king. He had proven himself a brilliant military commander in countless battles against rival Frankish nobles, Frisians, Saxons, and Burgundians. He understood infantry tactics, he knew how to train men, and critically, he understood that the Muslim cavalry sweeping north through France could be defeated if he could force them to fight on his terms. When word reached Charles that a massive Muslim army was advancing north, led by the Emir of Al-Andalus, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, Charles began assembling his forces. This took time. The Frankish military system was based on levies, farmers, and freemen who owed military service to their lords. You couldn't just snap your fingers and have an army. Men had to be summoned from across the Frankish territories. They had to gather weapons, provisions, and march to the assembly point. Meanwhile, the Muslim army was moving fast, living off plunder, sacking churches and monasteries filled with gold and treasures. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi was not some minor raider. He was the governor of Al-Andalus, an experienced military commander who had spent years consolidating Muslim control of Spain. His army was enormous by early medieval standards, perhaps 60 to 80,000 men, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. What is certain is that it was significantly larger than anything Charles could assemble. The core of the Muslim force was cavalry, including the famed Berber horsemen who had conquered North Africa and Spain. These were not knights in armor. They were fast, mobile, expert archers and lancers who could strike and withdraw before heavy infantry could respond. They wore lighter armor, relied on speed and maneuver, and had decades of experience fighting in diverse terrain. They had defeated every enemy they had encountered for 100 years. They believed they were invincible. Abdul Rahman's strategy was not primarily military conquest. It was wealth extraction. The monasteries and churches of France contained incredible riches: gold, silver, religious relics, treasures accumulated over centuries. The Muslim army moved like a flood, sweeping up everything of value, sending it back to Al-Andalus. Tours was the ultimate prize. The Basilica of St. Martin was one of the wealthiest religious sites in Europe. Taking it would provide enormous plunder and deliver a crushing psychological blow to Christendom. The fall of Tours would open the path to Paris and beyond. Europe would be open to Islamic conquest. Charles marched his army to intercept the Muslims somewhere between Tours and Poitiers. The exact location of the battle has been debated for centuries, but what matters is what Charles did when he got there. He chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army on a wooded, hilly ridge. This was deliberate. Cavalry is less effective charging uphill through trees. Charles wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking for terrain that would negate the Muslim cavalry advantage. His army was smaller, perhaps 30,000 men, though some estimates go as low as 15,000. Nearly all were infantry. The Franks had few mounted warriors. What they had was heavy infantry, men armed with spears, shields, swords, and most distinctively, the Francisca, a throwing axe that was the signature weapon of the Frankish warrior. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and craftsmen who had been summoned for war. But they were tough, disciplined, and they trusted Charles Martel. When the Muslim scouts reported the Frankish position, Abdul Rahman faced a dilemma. His cavalry was his strength. But attacking uphill through trees against a prepared infantry formation was risky. The smart move might have been to bypass the Franks, continue raiding, force Charles to chase him and fight on more favorable ground. But Abdul Rahman had immense confidence in his forces. They had defeated everyone they had fought. These Franks were just another obstacle, and the army was loaded with plunder. They couldn't move as fast while carrying all that treasure. Better to destroy this Frankish force quickly and continue the campaign. For several days, the two armies faced each other. This was common in medieval warfare. You didn't immediately attack. You scouted, positioned your forces, tried to understand what the enemy was planning. Charles used this time to strengthen his position. His men cut down trees, created rough fortifications, made sure their shield wall would hold. The Franks formed up in a dense infantry square, shields overlapping, creating a wall of wood and metal. Behind the shields, spears projected out like quills on a hedgehog. This was not an offensive formation. This was a fortress made of men. The Muslim cavalry circled, probed, looked for weaknesses. They saw none. Finally, Abdul Rahman gave the order to attack. The Muslim cavalry charged up the hill. The Franks stood firm. This is harder than it sounds. When you see cavalry thundering toward you, every instinct says to run. But if the shield wall breaks, everyone dies. So the Franks stood. And when the cavalry hit them, they absorbed the impact. The contemporary accounts, mostly written by Christian chroniclers decades later, so we must read them skeptically, describe the Franks as standing like a wall of ice. The Muslim cavalry crashed against them like waves against a cliff. The Franciscas flew through the air, dropping horses and riders. The spears thrust out, impaling those who got too close. The cavalry pulled back, reformed, and charged again. For hours, this continued. The Muslim cavalry was not designed for prolonged frontal assaults against heavy infantry. Their strength was mobility, flanking, feigned retreats to draw enemies out of formation. But Charles had chosen ground where those tactics didn't work. The woods and hills restricted maneuver. There was no good flanking route. The Franks simply refused to move. They stood on that ridge and killed every horseman who came close enough. The frustration in the Muslim ranks must have been immense. They had conquered empires, they had defeated the Persians and the Byzantines, and now they were being stopped by a wall of Frankish farmers. Abdul Rahman committed more and more of his forces. The charges became more desperate. Men and horses were dying in heaps at the base of the Frankish position. The ground became slick with blood. Wounded horses screamed. Riders thrown from their mounts were finished off by Frankish infantry, who darted out from the shield wall, struck, and retreated back to safety. This was not the glorious cavalry warfare the Muslims excelled at. This was a grinding, ugly melee where their advantages meant nothing. And then, something shifted. Rumors began to spread through the Muslim army that Frankish soldiers were attacking their camp in the rear, where all the plunder was stored. This may have been true. Charles may have sent a detachment to raid the Muslim camp, or it may have been a false report. Chaos and confusion spreading in an army that had been attacking unsuccessfully for hours. What matters is what happened next. Muslim cavalry began to break off from the battle and ride back toward their camp to protect their treasure. What started as a trickle became a flood. Units that had been fighting the Franks suddenly withdrew. Abdul Rahman rode into the chaos, trying to restore order, trying to stop the retreat. Contemporary sources claim he was killed in the confusion, struck down while trying to rally his men. Without their commander, without clear orders, and with fear spreading that they would lose all their plunder, the Muslim army broke. What had been a battle became a rout. The cavalry that had been the terror of 3 continents was fleeing south, abandoning the field, abandoning their wounded, racing to save their loot before the Franks could take it. Charles, watching from the ridge, did not pursue. This was the discipline that made him a great commander. His men were exhausted. They had been absorbing cavalry charges for hours. They were infantry. They couldn't catch fleeing horsemen. And more critically, he didn't know if this was a feigned retreat, a trick to draw him out of his strong position. So the Franks held the ridge through the night. They could hear the Muslim camp in the distance, could see their fires. Charles expected the battle to resume at dawn. But when morning came, the Muslim camp was empty. Under cover of darkness, the entire army had withdrawn. They had left their tents, much of their plunder, their wounded, everything they couldn't carry on a desperate night march south. The Battle of Tours was over. The Franks had won. Abdul Rahman was dead. The invasion of France had been stopped. The advance of Islam into Europe had reached its high water mark. Charles stood on that ridge, looking at the abandoned Muslim camp, understanding what had just happened. He had done something no one else had managed for 100 years. He had defeated a major Muslim army in open battle, not through superior numbers or cavalry or technology, through positioning, discipline, and the willingness of Frankish infantry to stand their ground while cavalry tried to break them. The news of the battle spread across Europe like wildfire. Christianity had been on the defensive for a century. Now, finally, they had won a major victory. Charles was hailed as the savior of Christendom. He was given the nickname that would define him, Martel, the Hammer, the man who had hammered the Muslim invasion flat. The historical significance of Tours is debated even today. Some historians argue it was the most important battle in European history, the moment that saved Western Christianity from being conquered by Islam. They point out that if Abdul Rahman had won, the path to Paris and beyond would have been open. The Frankish kingdoms were divided and weak. Nothing else stood between the Muslims and the complete conquest of France and possibly Germany and Italy. Christian Europe might have become Islamic Europe. Others argue the battle's importance has been exaggerated by European and Christian historians who needed a heroic narrative. They suggest the Muslim invasion was always primarily a raiding expedition, not a serious attempt at conquest, that Abdul Rahman was overextended, far from his supply base, and would have withdrawn eventually regardless, that the Muslim forces in Spain were never strong enough to permanently occupy and hold France even if they had won at Tours. This debate will likely never be resolved because we don't know Abdul Rahman's true intentions. We don't know if he planned to conquer France or was just raiding for plunder. What we do know is that after Tours, the Muslim forces in France were broken. They attempted some smaller raids in subsequent years, but never again with an army of 80,000. The momentum of Islamic expansion in the West had been stopped. Charles Martel did not rest on his victory. He spent the next decade consolidating his power, subduing rival Frankish nobles, and launching campaigns into Muslim-held territories in southern France. He pushed the Muslims back across the Pyrenees. He established fortified positions. He built the military and political power that would allow his son, Pepin the Short, to become the first Carolingian king of the Franks, and his grandson would be Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who would unite most of Western Europe and be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The dynasty that would dominate European politics for centuries began with Charles Martel's hammer blow at Tours. The battle also marked a shift in medieval military tactics. The age of the mounted knight was still centuries away, but Tours showed that disciplined heavy infantry could defeat cavalry. The Franks would build on this lesson. Later, Carolingian armies would combine heavy infantry with heavy cavalry, creating a military system that would dominate Western Europe for generations. The Muslims, meanwhile, would turn their attention elsewhere. The conquest of France was abandoned. The forces in Al-Andalus focused on consolidating their control of Spain, which they would hold for centuries. The great era of rapid Islamic expansion was over. The world had been divided. Islam would dominate the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. Christianity would hold Europe, and the battle that drew that line was fought on a ridge near Tours. Contemporary accounts of the battle are sparse and written by Christian chroniclers with obvious bias. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754 is the earliest, written just 22 years after the battle, and describes Abdul Rahman as being killed among the people of Austrasia, who had grown strong in battle. Later chroniclers, writing in the Middle Ages when the battle had already become legendary, embellished the story, added speeches and heroic moments that probably never happened. Arab sources barely mention the battle. This makes sense. For Christian Europe, Tours was a turning point, a moment of salvation. For the Islamic world, it was a minor defeat in a distant land, a raid that went wrong, not worth detailed recording. The disparity in how the two sides remembered the battle tells us something important. For Christians, Tours was existential. For Muslims, it was peripheral. Both perspectives contain truth. The battle itself lasted only one day, though accounts describe several days of skirmishing before the main engagement. The casualties are impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers threw around numbers that make no sense. One source claims the Muslims lost 375,000 men, which is obviously impossible since they didn't have that many to begin with. More realistic estimates suggest the Muslims lost perhaps 10 to 15,000 dead or captured, with the Franks losing 1 to 2,000. What matters more than the exact numbers is what the battle prevented. It stopped the invasion. It forced the Muslims to withdraw. It showed that they could be defeated. Charles Martel died in 741, 9 years after Tours. He never took the title of king, remaining technically the mayor of the palace, the power behind the Merovingian throne. But everyone knew who really ruled the Franks. His division of territory between his sons would lead to further civil wars, but his legacy was secure. He had saved Christian Europe. He had forged the military and political power that would lead to the Carolingian Empire. He had earned his nickname through blood and iron. The hammer had fallen on the enemies of Christendom, and they had been broken. In the centuries that followed, Tours became part of European mythology. It was taught as the moment Christianity survived its greatest threat. Medieval knights were told stories of their ancestors standing firm on that ridge. Renaissance scholars debated its significance. Enlightenment historians tried to separate fact from legend. Modern historians continue to argue about its importance, but what cannot be argued is that the battle happened, that the Franks won, and that after Tours, the Islamic conquest of Europe never resumed. Whether that was because of the battle itself or because the Muslims had never seriously intended to conquer Europe beyond raiding, the result was the same. The border was drawn. Europe would be Christian. Spain would be contested for centuries, but France, Germany, Italy, the heart of Western Europe, would remain Christian territory. If you stand today near Tours, in the fields and woods where the battle was fought, you can try to imagine it. The ridge where the Franks formed up, the open ground where the cavalry charged, the sounds of battle carried on an October wind. You can picture Charles Martel, not yet 50 years old, standing behind his shield wall, watching wave after wave of the finest cavalry in the world trying to break through. You can imagine the Frankish warriors, their arms aching from holding shields, their feet rooted to the ground, refusing to run despite every instinct screaming at them to flee. You can see the Muslim cavalry, frustrated and confused, watching their advantage slip away in the face of an enemy that simply would not move. You can feel the moment when the tide turned, when rumors of raids on their camp spread through the Muslim ranks, when discipline cracked and the retreat began. And you can understand why this moment mattered. Not just militarily, though that was important, but psychologically, spiritually, civilizationally. For a century, Islam had been winning. Every battle, every city, every kingdom, an unbroken string of victories that seemed to prove divine favor. And then, on one October day in 732, it stopped. Not because of better technology or numbers or resources, but because 30,000 Frankish infantry decided they would stand on a ridge and die before they let the enemy pass. Because Charles Martel understood that you don't always need to attack to win. Sometimes you just need to stand in the right place and refuse to move. The Battle of Tours was not the end of conflict between Christianity and Islam. The Crusades would come. The Reconquista would take centuries. The Ottoman Empire would threaten Europe from the east. But Tours was the moment when Christian Europe learned it could fight back. When the seemingly inevitable conquest was stopped. When the hammer fell and the world changed direction. Charles Martel never knew that his grandson would become Charlemagne. He never knew that historians would debate his battle for 13 centuries. He never knew that Tours 732 would become shorthand for the defense of Western civilization. He just knew that an enormous Muslim army was riding north through France, and somebody had to stop them. So he assembled his men, chose his ground, formed his shield wall, and stood firm. And when the cavalry came, he and his Franks did not break. They absorbed the charges. They held their ground. They fought not for glory or treasure, but for survival. For their families, their lands, their faith. And on that day, survival was enough. On that day, standing firm was enough. On that day, 30,000 Frankish infantry taught 80,000 Muslim cavalry that Europe would not fall without a fight, that the hammer of the Franks would not yield, that some lines cannot be crossed, that on 1 October, day in 732, near the town of Tours, the tide of history turned. Not because it was destined, not because God intervened, but because men decided to stand and die if necessary in defense of their world. And they stood, and they won, and Europe remained Christian, and Charles Martel became the hammer, and Tours became legend.